Helen. This session addresses one of the broad themes we wanted to address in this year's update. We're looking at sustainable migration for the future, and what I think we're very privileged in having three of not only Australia's great thinkers about migration and commentators on migration, but I think in all cases they are really great Australians and have made a really significant contribution to Australian universities and Australian society. The first of the speakers is Professor Ian Lowe. You can read all about his many accomplishments in the material provided at the outset of the conference. But I've known Ian since the late 1970s, and I really value his contribution to the discussion about Australia's population. It's been consistent and of high quality over a long period of time. He currently is president of the Australian Conservation Foundation, and I've over the years read a lot of the statements about population and environment which have come out of the ACF, and I think that those statements are marked by good scholarship, by balance, by real contributions to a discussion about population and the environment, not a debate about population and the environment. And I think for someone to give us a perspective on this topic from the environment perspective, we couldn't have anyone better to do it than Professor Ian Lowe.
Thanks very much, Graeme. It's ungracious to correct your introduction, but I've just been paroled from the presidency of ACF. There was a statute of limitations which kicked in, and I was informed by text about 5 hours ago that my successor had just been elected, so I'm now a free man. Sustainable migration, I'm going to be deliberately provocative. We started the day by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, and I wanted to remind you that the original Australians worked out over tens of thousands of years that for societies to endure, they need to have not just custom and practice, but a system of law that allows them to live in balance with natural systems. And I'd suggest to you that we whitefellas haven't yet learnt that lesson. We migrants and descendants of migrants, and that applies to almost all of us in this room, really need to think about that legacy of living in balance with natural systems. So, to be deliberately provocative, this is my paper. Are there any questions? The current scale of migration is not sustainable. It's, in my view, not sustainable ecologically. It may be sustainable economically, although there are some problems which most economists ignore, which I'll mention briefly. And there are social consequences of that, which most decision makers are still in denial about. But the fundamental issue is one of our capacity to live in balance with the natural systems of the driest inhabited continent. I had a couple of slides about population numbers, but these have been covered by other people, so I'll just skip through to the bottom line of the projections. The population would stabilise in about 25 years, somewhere under 30 million, if we had zero net migration from today. It would stabilise later at a higher level with net migration less than about 70,000 a year. At current migration rates and birth rate, the 2100 population will be over 60 million and growing. So there are a range of possible futures. There is not one predetermined future, which we are driven to by the laws of physics or the more improbable laws of economics. There are a range of futures, and which one occurs will be determined by the decisions we make as a community. 20 years ago, I was chairing the advisory council that produced the first national report on the state of the environment. And in the summary, we said that Australia has some very serious environmental problems: loss of our unique biodiversity, degradation of rural land, pressures on the coastal zone, spiralling greenhouse gas emissions, and the state of our inland rivers, particularly the Murray-Darling system, which should be of particular concern to people living at this end of it. We said that none of the problems have simple causes, They are the cumulative consequences of population growth and distribution, lifestyles, technologies, and demands on natural resources. There have been 3 subsequent reports, most recently in 2011, and the update is that some aspects of the environment are in good shape or improving, other parts are in poor condition or deteriorating, and as they said, our changing climate, which I think most Australians who aren't in the current federal cabinet understand to be an issue, our changing climate and growing population and economy confront us with new challenges. This is, in a sense, the bottom line. The environmental impact of people, this equation was developed about 40 years ago. Impact equals population times affluence times technology. Technology can either compound the impact or reduce it, but all other things being equal, it's proportional to population and affluence. So it will continue to grow proportionally to population unless affluence declines, and not many of those who are championing rapid migration are in favour of reduced affluence, or technology improves faster than the product of population and affluence grows, and that's a considerable challenge. So if you accept that in the long term we need to get back into balance with the natural systems of this continent, that means we have to reduce the global sum of the impact of humans on natural systems. The easiest way to do that is to stabilise the population and reduce the per capita impacts. If the population keeps increasing, that compounds the task of reducing impacts per person to get back in balance. So to make the most obvious point, if the 2100 population is 60 million and we want to get back in balance with natural systems, resource use would have to be less than a quarter per person what it is today, probably about 20% of what it is today. And to say that that's a huge technical challenge is, I think, only to state the bleeding obvious. Let me just say a couple of brief things about economic and social issues. It's clear that if the population increases, the overall GDP grows, and GDP per person probably grows slightly. Most studies of the so-called genuine progress index find that it declines with population. As an example of the components of economic growth, the Queensland Treasury did a paper to encourage us to trust population growth to solve all Queensland's problems for the Bligh Government's Growth Management Summit, and they found that the GDP per person in Queensland had increased at about 3% per annum over the previous decades, and they disaggregated that and found that 0.2% was a result of population increase, 0.6% was a result of increasing participation in the workforce, and 2.2% was a result of increasing productivity. So to break the sum down, Queenslanders were on average 50% wealthier than we were in 1990, but there are 40% more of us sharing the roads and the beaches and the golf courses and the health system. We would have been 46% wealthier, if you trust Treasury calculations, if there had been no growth in population. And I'd suggest to you that if people were given the choice, would you rather be 50% wealthier sharing everything with 40% more people, or 46% wealthier sharing it with the same number of people, there probably wouldn't have been a thumping majority for the outcome which we have achieved. That leads me to what I've called the infrastructure problem, which was first discussed by the US economist Lester Thurow nearly 30 years ago, and it's been developed locally by Dr. Jane O'Sullivan of the University of Queensland. Thurow's argument is that the average life of built infrastructure is about 50 years. If you look at energy supply, water supply, waste management, transport, some of it only lasts 30 years, some of it lasts close to 100, but 50 years is a good figure for a rough calculation. So the normal replacement bill would be about 2% of the total invested capital. If the population's growing by 2%, you need your 2% for normal replacement plus another 2% for the extra people. So the infrastructure cost is actually doubled by a population growth rate of 2%, which is about what we have in Australia. But the revenue base only increases by 2%. And writing nearly 30 years ago, Thurow said, anywhere where the population is growing by something like 2%, will be forced to do unpopular things like sell public assets or try to put together improbable public-private partnerships to try to meet the impossible infrastructure bill of the growing population. I suggest to you as an outsider that the problem is less severe in Adelaide than it is in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane or Perth, but all state governments in Australia are struggling with the problem of providing infrastructure where the revenue base does not meet the expectations of the growing population, which in turn leads to the social issues. I'm told by a political insider that when a politician called Kevin Rudd, which some of you may remember, said at the end of a television interview about something completely unrelated, when asked about a Treasury projection of the Australian population, "I believe in a big Australia." The insider tells me the focus groups went ballistic. And the reason, they said, was that because most migrants go to the cities, urban quality of life is, in the perception of many people, declining because infrastructure is lagging behind demand. And in the political blame game, migrants are more visible than the natural increase of Australians who are already there. So there is a tendency of politicians to blame migrants or, more generally, to get concerned about the issue. I was given a leaflet on my way in here today, as many of you probably were, suggesting that quality of life is inevitably declining as the population grows. This leaflet is couched in quite unemotional terms, but I keep getting propaganda from a group that used to be called Australians Against Further Immigration, which is almost nakedly racist and which has been encouraging people to write "reduce immigration" on ballot papers to try and stir up feeling against migration levels. The point I'm making is that if the economic problem of meeting the infrastructure demands of a growing population cause a perception that we cannot meet expectations and that our quality of life is declining, there is a risk of losing community support for a migration program which historically has been overwhelmingly successful. So the conclusion in ecological terms is that successive reports on the state of the environment have said unequivocally that we are currently degrading the natural systems of Australia. We are living beyond the sustainable capacity of Australia's natural systems. Our policies are now on track for about 3 times as many Australians by the end of this century. If sustainability, and I remind you that 20 years ago the Council of Australian Governments adopted the National Strategy for Ecologically Sustainable Development. So in principle, all state and territory governments and the Commonwealth Government are committed to the principle that we should develop in a way which is ecologically sustainable. Now, I don't see much evidence that those currently in power in Canberra even know of the document, let alone understand it, but in principle, we accepted 20 years ago as a country that our responsibility to future generations involves living in a way that doesn't reduce their opportunities. That means we need to significantly reduce the impact of the overall human population. It is possible, in principle, to do that even with a trebling of the population, but that is a huge technical challenge. My view is that for migration to meet the overall target of being part of a sustainable solution, it should be part of a population policy which is posited on the principle that in time we stabilise our population. I've said more about this in a book and in a chapter in Miller and Orchard's volume on public policy in Australia. It'd be unprincipled of me to promote those here, so I won't. So I'll just end on that note. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ian. What I propose to do is to hear from each of the 3 speakers, and then we'll have an open-ended discussion. I think we'll certainly have time to do that. Our next speaker will give us an economic perspective, and that'll be Professor Glenn Withers, who you heard from in that really fascinating talk earlier. I first met Glenn in the late 1980s when we were both on a thing called the National Population Council, which actually was charged by Prime Minister Bob Hawke to come up with a report which was on population and sustainability for Australia. And I must say that I don't know about Glenn, but I was really quite proud of what we produced in that process. And I still think that that document is really worth reading from the point of view of population sustainability in Australia, although it is now more than 20 years old. Unfortunately, the day I think it was that Glenn went to Canberra to deliver the report to Prime Minister Hawke, who'd shown this enormous amount of interest in the report, was the day that Paul Keating took over as Prime Minister. So the report never saw much publicity for that reason. But Glenn has been a fantastic Australian economist. He's been enormously unstinting in terms of the time he's given to government committees and other public activities. He's been a professor at La Trobe, he's been a professor and still is a professor at ANU, but he was also CEO of Universities Australia, a really important body. And I thought that during the period that he was there, that the advocacy role and principled ethical advocacy role that Universities Australia played at that time was a real credit to him, and I think that it did have quite a significant influence on policy. So we look forward to Glenn's remarks. Thanks.
Stay here? Oh, good, thanks. Having stood up before, I wouldn't mind sitting down. Having got up at, 4:30 a.m. to fly from Canberra to here today. So bear with me. Thanks very much, Graeme. And yes, I just remember so much that night where I was waiting in Hawke's office and Keating was circling and Hawke got rolled and our report was on his desk and was never seen again. It was, and the department, which didn't like it because it was actually wanting a whole of government approach in particular, saw that it got buried. And Keating, in turn, I worked for Keating for 7 years as head of the Economic Planning Advisory Commission, but and got on well with him, but he would not touch immigration. He refused to put that on the agenda for us to look at, and he was sort of a bit like Whitlam in a way. He was multiculturalist, but not pro-substantial immigration, whereas Hawke was a big migration booster. And so Keating was quite content to just let sleeping dogs lie and not pursue that further. And I think it was a pity because exactly what Graeme said. It was a report, for instance, Philip Toyne was the head of the ACF at the time and on the committee. We subtitled it Environment, Economy and Society, with environment first. And we sought balance. That is, we took the view as a committee. There were community reps, there were environmental community representatives and economic interests and so on around the committee. We took the view that and it was an appropriate view in the Hawke-Keating era, that single interest approaches were a problem for our society. What we needed was consensus where you at least respected and understood the views of others, tried to find what evidence you could about those views, and then try and at least narrow where you differed and make the hard decision for what's left, rather than just yell at each other from a distance. And we think we managed to conquer a bit of that in that report. I saw the same spirit once that Premier Bracks called a population summit in Melbourne. And I can remember Tim Flannery on the platform and Malcolm Fraser on the platform. And Tim said we need a population of 6 to 12 million to deal with our environmental problems. And Malcolm said we needed 50 million people to promote our economy and to take care of our security. And these were the opening statements. By the end of the conference, they were both down to a range of maybe 20 to 30 million. That the discussion as to where they were coming from and having to interact about it had narrowed the difference substantially. It didn't resolve it, it didn't produce, we're all happy now with just one figure. But it really got rid of the extremism and made constructive engagement quite possible, so you knew why you differed from other people. And then, of course, our political representatives were going to have to resolve the residual difference. And I think that's important in this area, that is to understand that there are legitimate concerns for economy, society and the environment and for the globe, because one of the worries is just a nationalistic perspective only. and especially environmental matters too. Migrants that are here have impacts elsewhere as well as here, and that's different from domestic population increase and so on, from natural increase. So getting the balance right, I think, is one of my lessons, but informing that process is the other lesson, and the loss of entities like the Bureau of Immigration, Population and Multicultural Research, the loss of the Economic Planning Advisory Commission, for that matter, those sorts of entities that inform government, and we've left with the Productivity Commission, and it does something of a reasonable-ish job, but it's not involved in competition. There's no balancing of its views in turn, and I think we're just less informed than we should be for reaching a probable balanced population policy. I'm not a gung-ho population booster, for instance. I think we go too far, and I think the Howard population increases were too much for reasons that Ian has begun to indicate. I don't have a problem with conditionality. That is, I do think I have a positive view about the benefits from population expansion for the economy. I think it can pave the way for ameliorating its adverse environmental effects and its adverse infrastructure and social effects. But you've got to deliver on that. It's not that it could do it, therefore just go ahead. Rather, you should have in place the systems that deliver on that, and if they don't deliver on it, then you don't boost population in those ways. That is, you should have the goal of balance and the delivery of that goal as a condition of policy. And I think that's really the way forward we need. And the crucial thing in that is leadership. And heaven knows, of course, in our present circumstances, we're not quite getting the visionary long-termist leadership that might make that happen, and that is a worry. We're not getting the information base, and we're not getting the leadership and the use of that information base. And so in that sense, I despair. But equally, for instance, I think the role of universities and community leaders can be the substitute. So if you can get enlightened business leadership, hopefully the Catherine Livingstons and enlightened union and community leadership more broadly, then that can make up for the political leadership problem until we get that fixed. And I'd like to see a bit more re-engagement on a collaborative basis by our community leaders in this area to try and define what our government should be doing for us and help us avoid that populist descent that we occasionally lapse into, unfortunately. So there's a number of conditions there for a way forward. They can be institutionalised, but they need leadership, and maybe the leadership's got to come from outside politics now.
Good. Thanks very much, Glenn. The third perspective comes from Peter McDonald, as you heard, a demographer. I've known Peter longest of all three of the speakers. I first arrived at ANU as a wide-eyed PhD student. I think it would have been 1972. And at that stage, Peter was in the airy heights of being the senior PhD student in the department, getting close to finishing his degree. And I must say that he was fantastic in so many ways when I was doing the PhD, not just in terms of making you feel at home and getting you into the culture of the department and everything, but certainly in terms of his scholarly work, which has always been a big influence on me. I regard him as one of my best and longest friends. He's had a real stellar career, and it's been capped off by becoming the president of the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population, which is really the peak body for scholars of population, and for an Australian to be given this high office, he has to be elected by people from the enormous range of countries around the world, in which he was. And I think that really is an indicator of the really high esteem which his work is held in globally. He's also, I think, been a fantastic contributor to our understanding of the dynamics of Australian population change, and I think his work on looking at the future, various scenarios of population, where I think particularly the work with Rebecca Kippen, which has looked at a whole range of different scenarios of population into the future and traced what some of those implications are, I think has been enormously helpful in our discussions of future population. So we look forward to hearing Peter's comments.
Thanks very much, Graeme. I come from the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU, as Glenn does, and I'd have to say that my views are almost exactly the same as Glenn's. So there's the party line, and the equation of the IPAT equation, I have a few problems with it, and as Glenn more or less said, I'm not convinced that increasing affluence is necessarily a bad thing as far as the impact on environment is concerned. I think there's a lot of evidence that used properly, affluence can be used to reverse the environmental damages that we do. And you know, if you just take a look at London, for example, you know, it's a much cleaner atmosphere today than it was, say, 300 years ago. So, and there have been changes. The example I'd like to use, though, is much closer to my home, and that's the city of Canberra. Canberra is the most affluent city in Australia, and by 2020, 90% of its energy requirement is going to be met from renewable sources. And we're on track to meet that target. And we're able to do that partly because it is the most affluent city in Australia. Canberra also at the moment is is looking at a light rail system. This is a bit more controversial, and because of its cost. I've always been a supporter of the light rail system in Canberra because I've seen it operate in cities of the same kind of size, in European countries, for example, European cities. But if we don't get a light rail system in Canberra, it's going to be because of its cost, because we don't have the money to do it. And another reason is that Canberra, unlike European cities, is incredibly spread, very poorly designed. You know, it's spread out over an enormous area. And so the population along the line is just not kind of big enough to sustain the light rail system, potentially. Nevertheless, I look at the light rail system as something for the next 100 years, and once you amortise the cost over that 100 years, it's in my view, the right thing to do. But Canberra's at the same time is not saying, well, let's stop the population growth. It's not seeing population as a cause of problems. And indeed, the ACT government's plans, like most state governments, for population growth are way above what's likely to happen. So that that's I think an argument that's important. As for where we're heading in population growth, as the big numbers that Graeme put up before about population projections and how they've changed, you know, take me back 15 years, and I would have said current day migration impossible. No, we're not going to have that 250,000 a year sustained over a long period of time. Yet now we do have it, and it's been running along for a little while. How long is that likely to last? I don't really know, is what the lesson I've learned from that, from the past. I think there are signs that migration might come back a bit, not in the short term. I think we've got some built-up demand that will keep migration relatively high. There's the 485 visa that Glenn had a bit to do with, I think. I think this is a visa which allows international students to remain in Australia for 2 years after they finish their undergraduate degree, and they are able to work in whatever job that they would like. And that is it's only just starting to appear now, its impact. So I think that will actually have a longer-term impact in keeping migration up over the next few years. Over the last few years, part of the reason for the high migration and the sustained migration was the Indian student phenomenon back in 2008. The Indian student phenomenon has been there. You can see it going right through the system. And you can trace it. 2010, the government stopped it and said changed the permanent migration qualifications, but it allowed those students to stay here and continue on and apply for permanent migration. Eventually, if they could succeed, and you see them moving through visa types, getting another student visa, getting a 457 visa, going right through into permanent migration, and that's why they are now by far the biggest category of permanent migration that you saw from Graeme's slide. It's those Indian students from 6 years ago, 7 years ago. So we can build up things in the system that keep going, and I think that's what's been happening. But in the longer term, however, though, it's about labour demand partly to a large extent. If the economy slows down a bit, then I think the migration will slow down a bit. There's every evidence that the kind of demand within the system, except for those couple of groups I was talking about, is softening quite a lot. That the number of applications for permanent migration has softened a lot in recent times. And a final category, which is in the system at the moment, which will also, I think, have to be addressed, is the family migration, and that there are now in the system 62,000 spouses of Australian citizens and Australian residents, permanent residents, waiting for permanent residence in Australia. The problem has been that the government has set the family migration at half the skilled migration, and they won't move on that. Yet the demand for the family is higher than that. And so what's been happening is this big pipeline growing of spouses. These are spouses of Australian citizens. And there's 62,000 of them. I think the Australian government's probably breaking the law because the Immigration Act says that spousal migration shall not be capped. I think it is being capped effectively. And so that will have to be addressed at some point in time. It's also a problem in that if you're a skilled migrant from somewhere, you can bring in your spouse immediately. If you're an Australian citizen, you can't. So it's a little bit ridiculous. So that's the way that I see it. I think migration is in, say, 5 years' time, might start to taper off a bit. But as I say, overall, my views are the same as those of my colleague Glenn.
Thanks very much, Peter. We've left quite a bit of time for discussion. There's a huge number of issues there, which I'm sure people will be very keen to take up. I think there's a really substantial number of things there, and I like the idea which came up of not seeing Australia's future population purely sort of hermetically sealed off from the global population, and I think it really is important to, in any development of population and migration policy in Australia, that it is done in that wider context. Now, have we got some questions? Constance. Yeah. Yes, down there, is it?
Yes, I'd like to pick up from what you were saying. To me, the climate crisis is the crisis that we have to address in the short term and the long term before all others. Carbon dioxide emissions do not stay above the country where they're emitted. They go right round the world. Climate systems do not affect those who have emitted more than those who have not emitted. They go right round the globe and affect everywhere. And the solutions can only come from international coordination. And to be talking and thinking and writing and researching about the impacts on the Australian environment of immigration into Australia seems to me to be a diversion from the real issues. In what way does an immigrant coming in from another country and contributing perhaps to emissions in Australia, in what way is that worse than them staying where they are and emitting where they are? Especially if we are able to produce an economy and society which is more sustainable than the places they're coming from. And if we're able, they will modify perhaps their birth rates to accommodate to Australian levels. So that's my first point. My second point is that I am not an environmentalist, I'm not a geographer, and I have worked in the same corridor as environmental people, and I'm endlessly getting into debates with them in which I don't see invasive species as the major danger. I look around the environments of a big city and I see wildlife. I see wildlife in my garden in the Adelaide suburbs. When I took a train from Adelaide to Darwin, I saw very little wildlife. This may be ignorant and this may be I'm observing the wrong things, but it seems to me there is no strict correlation between population density and impact on the environment. It's not in the cities, it's not in Canberra and in Adelaide that we're doing the most damage perhaps. It might be in the outback, it might be in the outer areas, it might be out on the oceans.
Great, thanks Constance. Now what I might do is just collect a few questions I think, and could people keep their questions to a fairly concise statement? That's fine Constance, yeah. Just over here and then here.
Thank you. My question's for Professor Lowe. Global population is currently sitting at around 7.2 billion, with projections to increase. Depending on which study you look at, it could be up to 16 billion by 2100, or it could drop to 6. In any case, even if we look at one of the futures that you proposed, where we might have a population of 60 million by 2100, that's a drop in the ocean compared to what's happening on a global scale. This idea of restoring the balance between the Australian population and the natural systems, is it something that we can really do even if we tried when you've got the global scale to deal with?
Just over here. Did you want a question?
Actually, you've covered some of my query, but it seems that Australia is one of the few countries in the OECD that's talking about population and long term, which is great. I mean, we even have a political party, but it seems like we're very much the little boy with a finger in the dike when it comes to the climate refugees that will be coming en masse. And it seems a little bit naive that we can pretend that we're going to be able to control some of that. So what can we recommend to our government about that impending refugee wave? It seems a little bit like we're just talking about dicking around the edges with our own policies.
Over here.
Yeah, hello. Pishan Seat from Flinders Uni, the business school. I know you mentioned a few times about talent wars and circulation and things like that. I mean, my research is in the area of brain circulation, talent, global mobility, and I'm just wondering if, following up on some of the points raised, that if people are moving around much more frequently, how does this impact some of the theories and the models that you guys are putting up in terms of, it seems to be one way that people come in and stay here, and if there's more of this going on, would that affect some of the issues around sustainability and population projections? And
just a question here. Thanks.
My question was really about what you define stabilising to be. Do you talk about that in terms of the size of the population? You talk about that in terms of the age structure, because both of those will have different implications in terms of where growth may come from in the future. So just clarifying that, particularly with an ageing population, the need to have a labour replacement strategy as well.
I might get the speakers to respond to that set of questions first. So maybe starting with Glenn.
Ooh, okay. Gee, the W's starting, that's wonderful. We're usually at the end of alphabeticism. A whole bunch of interesting issues there, I'm not sure we'll get quite the same convergence as we were seeing before. One is on the global population. I think the power of women matters most here. That is, what is going on is that really the global population is going to peak at maybe 9, 10, 11 billion, and that's a heck of a big ask for the Earth to sustain. But after that, it is going to decline, and the reason is that 70% of the countries of the world now have fertility below replacement because women's education and women's work participation has meant that child numbers per family have decreased substantially, and the remaining countries show all signs of joining that, including welcome economic growth in Africa, which has had that same effect. So that the standouts are increasingly small for high fertility rates. So I think the long haul is great for global population pressure. Of course, managing that for the next 20 or 30 years is a big ask, and that's a different issue. But the momentum is there, and it really is our behaviour that now has to be managed rather than the population increase itself. It's disappointing that Australia, for instance, then abandons things like carbon taxes and doesn't transition to an ETS, which is where we could have, dare we say it, punched above our weight. For heaven's sake, we can lead the world into sort of, Ukraine and, sort of all sorts of interventions with the Soviet Union, and yet we sort of say, oh, we have no influence whatsoever on climate change, we're just a little country. We can lead morally and through our ingenuity, and should be doing so in the global environment sphere. And even in an area like refugees themselves, lead on that. Dare I say it, in Adelaide, Amanda Vanstone was, to me, the most impressive minister in the Howard government in this area. She wonderfully, for the only time in about 15 years, increased the refugee intake, just pushed it through. And otherwise, we stuck around at 12,000 and hardly ever wanted to increase it. She pushed it right up to 14 or 15,000, as I recall, just by her power of personality. And we saw the figures earlier today of how we're still stuck around, 12, 14 or whatever, even when the other migration programs are a couple of 100,000. And why we haven't kept parity there and seen that we can expand both, to me, is shameful. And Vanstone was a wonderful exception in showing leadership in that respect. Quickly on the other final matter that I wanted to talk about, which was the brain circulation type question. Economists now get very excited at the notion of what they call the $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk. What this means is, just as economists argue that if you liberalise trade and investment flows, you can increase global affluence for the same population, and provided then in turn environmental controls are appropriate for the use of that affluence, then we can manage to be a better world, a big proviso. But what they mean is that if people could move a bit more around the world, then we could possibly double world GDP. And therefore, and when that brain circulation is increasingly associated with more and more education and skills, maybe then we can manage it well too, and make sure that the use we make of our affluence is more compatible with the pressure we're placing on our natural resources environment. So I see brain circulation as perhaps part of a solution and not a problem. And of course, to globalise us and internationalise us, again, I see as a wonderful thing to improve understanding. So I think that's a great way forward.
Ian?
Thanks, Chairman. There's a range of issues there that I'd like to comment on briefly. I agree totally with Glenn about global population. And the three things that correlate with a low birth rate are people being secure, women being educated, and women being substantially in control of their fertility. And I think that there's every indication that there's a demographic revolution going on around the world as more women are educated, more women are secure, and more women are in control of their fertility. So I don't see any risk of 16 or 18 million, billion. I think it's much more likely to stabilise somewhere like 7 or 9. there's been a few questions about affluence, and there's no doubt that wealth can be used to clean up the environment. In general, wealthier countries have better environmental standards than poor countries. It's a matter of how the affluence is used. The other side of that coin is that the consumption atlas that ACF and Choice did found that there was a very clear association. On average, the wealthier the area you live in, the larger the ecological footprint of people in your area. That in Australia, wealthier people in general have bigger houses, they have larger cars, they have more appliances, they consume more electricity, they consume more water probably. So it's a matter of how the affluence is used. I think that we used to have very good environmental standards in Australia, and they've been steadily eroded, I think, by a sort of ideological fixation that the economy is the be-all and end-all, that if only the gross domestic product becomes sufficiently gross, we can solve any problems. And the obsession with, for example, reducing green tape is based on a perception that unnecessary regulation is holding back, because of mindless concern about environmental impacts, economic activities that should be going ahead. But the ABS study of measures of Australia's progress show that all our economic indicators are positive and most of the environmental indicators are negative. So any rational analysis would say rather than green tape holding back the economy, perhaps economic activities that should have been better regulated are doing needless damage to the environment. In terms of Australia, what Australia can do, I mean, I think in the unconsciously wise words of a former Australian foreign minister, we can't behave as if Australia was an island, you know. We have to accept that issues like climate change are a global problem and can only be resolved by global action. But that means that we have to play a responsible part. And 18 months ago, I was quite happy at international conferences to say that I thought we were playing a responsible part. We had a package of measures, not just the modest price on carbon dioxide, which wasn't nearly enough to influence investment, but other measures like the Renewable Energy Target, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the Biodiversity Fund and so on, which together were a responsible position for a fuel-intensive nation to be taking. My worry is that we're now rapidly going backwards, and it's once again an embarrassment at an international conference to admit that you're an Australian. We can't by ourselves resolve climate change, but we can play a responsible role. But we can do something about our local problems, like the state of the Murray-Darling, like the loss of our biodiversity, and we should be doing what we can in those areas. I just wanted to make a final comment about the ageing population, and I think that that's not as big a problem as many people argue. There was a time in our history when there was a significant demand in the workforce for young, fit, strong people, particularly in primary industry. Today, many fewer people work in primary industry as a proportion of workforce than at any previous time in our history. In fact, total employment in agriculture, forestry, fishing and mining is less than the number of people who work in cafes, restaurants and takeaway food outlets. It's a minority area, and even in primary production, most people are now using advanced technology rather than swinging a pick or wielding a scythe. So I don't think the fact that the population's ageing is necessarily a problem. I mean, just to underline that point, I'm alive and writing books which sell and playing cricket at an age when my father was dead, both my grandfathers were dead. In fact, all of my male ancestors were no longer alive at my age. We are living longer and we are healthier for longer. And in a service-dominated economy, people can be productive well beyond the age at which it used to be thought that you needed to hang up your shingle and stop working. So I'm not as concerned about ageing as some people. In fact, there have been societies in human history where wisdom was valued rather than brawn. I remember there was a Prime Minister who said we should aim to become a clever country, but then the Prime Ministership changed and that went out the window. So we're now on target to be the stupid country.
Thanks, Ian. Peter.
Just flowing off from what Ian said about ageing, I agree with those views as well, that the aged not the problem that they're made out to be. The issue, though, for a lot of countries is not the large number of aged people, but the small number of young people. Countries that have very low birth rates are going to see their young populations drop very dramatically, and this includes China. China's working age, entry age groups is going to drop in half in 30 years. These are very, very substantial changes, and I agree about the wisdom of the aged, of course, but I see the aged, older workers and younger workers as being complementary, that older workers do have that wisdom, etc. A lot of them maybe don't, but yeah, young workers certainly have the technological skills, much more so, and I think the two working together are important. So age structure is important from that point of view, I think. It's not the old people, it's the young people is the problem, the shortage of the young people. Not for us, though. We don't have that problem. But on Australia's age structure and migration, it is said that, migrants just get old, like everybody else. But migrants have a hell of a lot of children before they get old. That makes a big difference to Australia's age structure. The world population growth, we're putting on an extra 2 billion. They are almost all located in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. All of that 2 billion. There's an extra 100 million, though, in the United States. And one might suspect that the footprint of the 100 million in the United States is actually going to be bigger than the 2 billion in those other places. So that needs to be taken into account. But as far as sub-Saharan Africa is concerned, some of the growth of population is just frightening. Countries like Nigeria going from 130 million to over 400 million in the next 30 or 40 years. It's just frightening. And when I was president of the IOSSP, we were very active in trying to get family planning going again, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. The refugee comments and the refugee wave. Look, the only comment I'd make there is that how lucky we are to have Indonesia to our north in its present state. If Indonesia balkanised, which was always a possibility, then we would get the huge boatloads of people coming on Australian shores, and the Australian Navy would not be able to stop them. So the stability of Indonesia and its political stability is extremely important, and we're very lucky that the Indonesians have managed to do that to this point. About the talent wars and the circulation, etc., you do see it in the 457 movement, that 457s divide pretty much between those who have no interest in staying in Australia long term and those who do. And there's a pretty big divide between them. And maybe 50% of them are just working in Australia for various reasons, short term, they're off again. Now that group of people, interestingly, tends to live in the central cities. They're very much living in the high-rise apartment blocks and so on, in the centre of Sydney and the centre of Melbourne. And so it is a population concentration thing that's going on with that group that are moving around the world all the time. And I think I've reached the end of what I was going to say. Yeah.
Well, due to the superb chairmanship, we've actually done it perfectly on time. Thanks very much to my colleagues who not only have spoken very well, but have stuck to time. I think the discourse about migration is probably the area of public policy which is most subject to misinformation, bigotry, self-interest, and really low quality of, I never call it discussion, but debate. And I think what we've seen today is a real discussion in which people are bringing their expertise from different disciplinary perspectives to look at the issue. And I think this is something we need much more of in Australia. I'd like you to thank our three speakers. Thanks.